Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, 11 December 2024. It is the 123rd anniversary of the birth of Michael Oakeshott, who was born in London on this date in 1901. Oakeshott is primarily remembered as a political philosopher, but his first book, Experience and its Modes, published in 1933, doesn't prima facie appear to be about politics, and it explicitly engages with some of the problems of philosophy of history. So, what is a mode of experience? Oakeshott wrote, quote, "Experience is a single whole within which modifications may be distinguished, but which admits of no final or absolute division, and that experience everywhere not merely is inseparable from thought, but is itself a form of thought." Unquote. He goes on to say that it's fine to analyze experience, but the abstractions we obtain through an analysis are not the same as the experience itself. Also, these abstractions only give us a fragmentary view of the world, and there's a natural response to this fragmentation to reintegrate these abstractions into a coherent whole. This is my gloss on Oakeshott and not how Oakeshott himself explains it. One of the problems of avoiding long quotations, which is something I've been trying to do, not entirely successfully, is that the avoidance of quotation means a lot more paraphrase. And paraphrase is effectively a filter that tells you more about how I interpret Oakeshott than what Oakeshott himself said. But if you wanted to know what Oakeshott himself said, you'd read his books and papers. And so in lieu of that, I'm communicating to you some small fragment of Oakeshott and trying to make it stand on its own as a coherent statement. This is, as I understand it, what Oakeshott took to be a mode of experience. So my presentation of Oakeshott's ideas is a mode of experiencing Oakeshott and is not the same thing as a direct experience of Oakeshott. Now that I've made that point, here's another quote to underline the idea. Quote, "In experience, there is the alternative of pressing forward toward the perfectly coherent world of concrete ideas or of turning aside from the main current in order to construct and explore a restricted world of abstract ideas. The full obligations of the character of experience are avoided when, as so often, the attempt to define, the attempt to see clearly and as a whole, is surrendered for the abstract satisfaction of designation." Unquote. So what I am attempting here today is the abstract satisfaction of designating Oakeshott. Part 3 of Experience and its Modes explicitly takes up historical experience, so that we find philosophy of history in Oakeshott's first book. At the beginning of Part 3, he explains his intention in taking up the problem of historical experience. Quote, "My intention is to consider the character of history in order to determine whether it be experience itself in its concrete totality or an arrest in experience, an abstract mode of experience, and further, to determine the general character of the relationship between history as a world of experience and other worlds of experience." Unquote. In the next paragraph, he partially answers his own question by further elaborating his theoretical intention. Quote, "While my plan is to consider the truth of history, the validity of history as a world of experience, the historian is engaged in the attempt to establish truth or coherence in the world of history itself. And it will be said that whatever else there is in favor of such a discussion, it cannot be contended that it will give us an adequate view of history." Unquote. Oakeshott's interest then isn't in the concrete totality of experience, but in some arrested fragment drawn from that concrete totality. Oakeshott is setting up world history as though it were a self-contained universe, and he openly says that this isn't about giving an adequate view of history. His aim is to give an account of history as a mode of experience. And as it turns out, history seems to be especially suited to give an exposition of a mode of thought that draws from the concrete totality of experience, but has its own method of reconstituting a totality. Oakeshott writes, Quote, what is given in history, what is original from the standpoint of logic, is a system of postulates. But secondly, the mind of the historian, even where it is free from mere prejudice and preconception about the course of events, even where it is free from the most crippling of all assumptions of history that the past is like the present, contains not only a system of postulates, but also a general view of the course of events, an hypothesis governed by these postulates. No historian ever began with a blank consciousness, an isolated idea, or a genuinely universal doubt, for none of these is a possible state of mind. He begins always with a system of postulates, largely unexamined, which define the limits of his thought, and with a specific view of the course of events, a view consonant with his postulates, unquote. And further along, he emphasizes that, quote, the work of the historian consists in the transformation of this world as a whole in the pursuit of coherence, unquote. So the historian is seeking a transformation of the world in pursuit of, I guess, what we could call historical incoherence. And here we find again, as we've seen in other philosophers of history who have fallen under the spell of idealism, a willingness to conflate res gestae with historiam rerum gestarum, or past actuality with the record of past actuality. Quote, history is experience, and not a course of events independent of experience. There is indeed no course of events independent of experience. History is not the correspondence of an idea with an event, for there is no event which is not an idea, unquote. This is entirely consistent with idealism, as most idealist philosophers employ some variation of the coherence theory of truth, according to which truth is how well a given proposition coheres with accepted propositions, while most naturalistic philosophers employ some variation of the correspondence theory of truth, in which truth is correspondence to fact. This isn't all that different from what we saw in the previous episode on Johann Huizinga, who argued that history synthesizes a multiplicity of forms, but history itself is also, in turn, a form. For Oakeshott, history is a mode of experience, but we have nothing but experience, so history is merely a subdivision of our experience. In both Huizinga and Oakeshott, there is a reflexivity such that history is self-referential. In Huizinga, it's the self-referentiality of forms, and in Oakeshott, it's the self-referentiality of experience. And we can easily see how this is the case. It would, for example, be possible to write a history drawing exclusively from the historical mode of experience, never touching on what Huizinga called other forms of life. In fact, historians do write history that draw only on other histories as their primary source material and on nothing but histories. So history is a particularly good example of the kind of reflexivity noted, if only implicitly noted, by Oakeshott and Huizinga. So we can take as an exception the historian who in studying an age actively enters into other modes of experience, non-historical modes of experience, such as, for example, art or food preparation or building traditions and so on. Historians often do draw from specifically political and military modes of experience, since political history is the most familiar form of history, and it's probably the source of the idea that history is a dull and dreary recitation of names, dates, and places. Other historians, reacting against this, have sought to draw more widely on modes of experience, and here again I can cite Huizinga, or in the American tradition, Will and Ariel Durant, who began their story of civilization saying that they would address a wide range of human experiences, and I think they were mostly successful in this. A couple of passages from Oakeshott's posthumously published notes in the posthumously published volume, What is History and Other Essays, give an interesting glimpse of the man at work. Of Plato, Oakeshott wrote, quote, books 2 to 7 of the Republic may be regarded as a philosophy of history, but it is in no sense an historical account. And for this reason, all account of the reaction from without, which plays so great a part in actual societies, is omitted, unquote. It's very rare for a philosopher to claim to find a philosophy of history in Plato, but here we are with Oakeshott attributing a philosophy of history to Plato's Republic, which we would typically think of as a work of political philosophy. This is particularly significant for Oakeshott, whose oeuvre is primarily political philosophy, inviting us to find a philosophy of history in his own political philosophy. In another posthumous note, this time on Hegel, Oakeshott wrote, quote, Hegel's philosophy of history is great history, but often poor philosophy. Hegel had that purely historical literary interest in his work as well as the philosophical, and sometimes it gets the upper hand, unquote. Both of these passages, the one I read on Plato and the one on Hegel, represent views somewhat out of the mainstream of philosophy, and they highlight Oakeshott's independence of mind in that way. I don't know of any other philosopher who has said that Hegel's philosophy of history was better history than it was philosophy. That's definitely a minority view. Oakeshott wrote 2 essays titled The Philosophy of History, one from 1928 and one from 1948. Oakeshott gives a sketch of his reading of Spengler in his 1928 The Philosophy of History, when in the 1920s it was almost obligatory for philosophers of history to at least mention Spengler. But then he goes on to comment as follows, quote, in this view of things, there seem to me to be 3 entirely false assumptions. First, there is no single fact of history, the nature and meaning of which is or can be finally settled. And in consequence, the material to build our general laws is wanting. Secondly, these laws are not in point of fact abstract and universal like those of physics, because they are concerned with transitory, essentially non-recurrent event. And thirdly, this philosophy of history ignores the most fundamental characteristic of facts as viewed historically, their individuality. For history, events are not instances of a law. They are unique facts happening at a particular time and in a particular place. And it is their uniqueness, the fact that these events never happened before and can never happen again, which is significant, unquote. Here, Oakeshott seems to be entirely on board with an ideographic conception of history in which there are and can be no patterns or regularities, only unique particulars. If that were all there were to Oakeshott, there wouldn't be much new here, though his argumentation is interesting since he supplements the conventional argument with the observation that history offers nothing from which to construct general laws. But there is more. Oakeshott follows through with an idealist conception of history more systematically than most idealist philosophers of history. Not content merely to conflate past actuality with the record of past actuality, Oakeshott goes Popper one better in denying the role of causality in history. Preston King, in his 1981 paper, Michael Oakeshott and Historical Particularism, compared Oakeshott to Popper. Quote, Popper then asserts with Oakeshott that history involves the appreciation of the unique. But unlike Oakeshott, he does not repudiate what he calls causal explanation in history, unquote. According to King, Oakeshott goes further than Popper in repudiating causal explanation in history. In Oakeshott's 3 essays on history, including in On History and other essays, Oakeshott gives his argument against, quote, the claim that the significant relationship between historical events sought in an historical inquiry must be a causal relationship, unquote. Oakeshott identifies 2 kinds of ways in which historians attempt causal explanations. Quote, there are 2 distinct versions of this contention. In the first, an historical inquiry is said to be an engagement to explain reported bygone occurrences or situations by understanding them as examples of the operation of universal laws or regularities, which it is the task of the inquiry to ascertain and formulate. The second version of this claim is more circumspect. It has nothing to say about an historical process or about laws of historical change or development. It is an undertaking, first, to spell out exactly the logical structure of causal explanation, and secondly, to sustain the thesis that an historical inquiry, as an engagement to establish a past composed of significantly related antecedent and subsequent events must be an inquiry of this kind, unquote. We can see implicit in this distinction between two kinds of causal explanation an earlier distinction that appears in 3 essays on history in part 1, where Oakeshott distinguishes between, quote, the notional grand total of all that has ever happened in the lives of human beings, unquote, and, quote, a certain sort of inquiry into and a certain sort of understanding of some such passage of occurrence, the engagement and the conclusions of an historian, unquote. This is the familiar distinction between past actuality and the record of past actuality that I mentioned earlier. But Oakeshott seems to have adopted this familiar distinction, adapted, I should say, this familiar distinction to causal explanation. In 3 essays on history, part 3, Oakeshott observes that causal has been used very loosely in history, meaning that his criticism of causal explanation does not necessarily apply to every historical claim of causal explanation. And then he goes on to identify comparison, correlation, and analogy as what is actually going on in history rather than causal explanation. At the end of section 2, Oakeshott gives something of a summary to his argument, though it must be read in full to be appreciated. So this will be a longer quote, which I said earlier I was trying to avoid, so bear with me if you can. Quote, an historical event, then, has no necessary or essential character. It is a conflation of accessories which here have no exclusive characters, but are the difference they made in a convergence of differences which compose a circumstantial historical identity. Such identities may differ in magnitude and in complexity, but they are alike in being the conclusions of enquiries and themselves answers to historical questions about the past which admit of no other kind of answer. An historical inquiry is not an explanatory exercise, nor is it a concern to solve a problem. It is an engagement to infer, to understand discursively, and to imagine the character of an historical event. It begins in a present past of survivals, and at each stage it is necessarily sustained only in terms of a reading of the circumstantial evidence it invokes. To seek the authentic utterance of a survival from the past, to anatomize a situation which has not survived, and to understand the character of an historical event which could not have survived, each are inquiries concerned to understand what has been somehow identified, but the character of which is not yet understood. An historian is never in a position to look back from an already understood historical situation or event and to conclude what must have been its components or significant antecedents. And the conclusion of an historical inquiry cannot be confirmed or falsified by comparing it with the conclusions of any other kind of inquiry, and it cannot be tested against independent criteria of credibility, those of a current common sense or of a reading of so-called human nature. As nothing here is necessary, so also nothing is impossible. Historical writings differ greatly in the perceptiveness they exhibit in the consideration of the circumstantial evidence they employ, in the quality of the imagination they display in the construction of an historical event, and in the idiosyncratic deviations of their authors from this engagement. But somewhere in every genuine historical inquiry, there is an undertaking of this sort, and this is what constitutes it an historical inquiry, unquote. So I think this is refreshingly distinct from the usual run of ideographic formulations of history, and it implies a refreshingly distinct formulation of the philosophy of history as a discipline that would philosophically examine this distinct conception of history. This comes from late in Oakeshott's life, but we can see in his earlier writings that he was working toward a distinctive conception of history, and therefore a distinctive conception of philosophy of history. In other areas of his thought, Oakeshott can be relatively conventional. For example, in the other philosophy of history essay from 20 years later in 1948, which was prepared for a broadcast talk, he distinguishes 3 intellectual exercises that have all gone by the label of philosophy of history, which are 1, and these three will all be quotes. 1, the study of the course of past events in an attempt to detect some general principle or principles which would make the whole thing hang together. 2, a study of the problems and methods of historical research with what may be called methodology. And 3, an inquiry into the nature and presuppositions of this inquiry called history. And the aim of the study is to reach some conclusions about the nature of historical truth and the validity of historical knowledge. It's easy to recognize in this tripartite distinction the familiar distinction between speculative and analytical philosophy of history, with historiography sandwiched in between the two and made into a distinct discipline that he's calling philosophy of history as well. And we usually inquire the distinction only in this way, and Oakeshott expands it into from a dichotomy into a tripartite distinction. It's worth noting that Oakeshott can take familiar and conventional ideas and transform them into something unexpected, as we saw with his use of the distinction between past actuality and the record of past actuality. Thus, Oakeshott could similarly make creative use, or someone working from Oakeshott's creative template could make use of this familiar distinction between speculative and analytical philosophy of history. Oakeshott's ideographic conception of history may not be conventional in every way, but it's conventional in the sense that it is a well-established position in the philosophy of history, and Oakeshott only makes it interesting by pushing it farther than others have. I could call this a non-cognitive philosophy of history, since Oakeshott has effectively forbidden us any way of understanding history through the exclusion of general concepts and the denial of causality in history, but this isn't quite right. Experience and its modes lays out Oakeshott's way of understanding history, and his careful breakdown of the various enterprises that have been called philosophy of history implies a willingness to engage in an analysis of the problem. A truly non-cognitive philosophy of history wouldn't take the trouble to erect this elaborate conceptual framework for the analysis of history. Analysis implies some degree of cognition of the object of analysis. I could say instead that Oakeshott is a more consistent idealist in the philosophy of history than was Collingwood, and it's intrinsically interesting that Oakeshott pursues his idealist reasoning about history as far as he does without getting trapped into a Hegelian position. This is as surprising in its own way as the Annales School's historians not throwing in with Marxists and historical materialism, despite Braudel writing a book on material civilization. We have to reckon with the fact that, despite England's tradition of empiricist philosophy, both Oakeshott and Collingwood, who made philosophy of history respectable in the English-speaking world, were both idealists, and they gave an idealist impetus to Anglophone philosophy of history that often goes unremarked and unrecognized. Finally, I could say that Oakeshott, like all idealist philosophers, gives us a non-naturalistic philosophy of history. Oakeshott's non-naturalism is something like Husserl's non-naturalism, since it doesn't present itself as we might expect non-naturalism to present itself. I tend to get non-naturalistic philosophies wrong because I've thought myself so deeply into the naturalistic presuppositions that it's difficult to appreciate the non-naturalistic view as it was intended to be appreciated. I have this same difficulty in reading Husserl when I have to engage in my own suspension of judgment and a bracketing of my assumptions to try to enter into his presuppositions to the point that they begin to make sense on their own terms. Since Oakeshott learned his philosophy in England, his idealism and his non-naturalism have a very different flavor from those more orientated to continental thought, and that was as true 100 years ago as it is today. Significantly, Oakeshott attended J.M.E. McTaggart's lectures at Cambridge, and McTaggart was one of the great British idealists, as I discussed in my episode on McTaggart. McTaggart must have left a deep impression on Oakeshott, since Oakeshott retained these idealist modes of thought throughout his life. There's even a sense in which I could say that Oakeshott's philosophy of history was the philosophy of history that McTaggart never wrote. And so with Oakeshott, we have a distinctively British idealist philosophy of history. Oakeshott's argumentative framework is more subtle than McTaggart, and from this we get a subtle but pervasively idealist conception of history. Happy birthday, Michael Oakeshott, and thanks for listening.